Okay, look, can I welcome everyone, and extremely good to see so many people. Michael tells me we have 30 here today, and this is really going back to pre-COVID levels of attendance, so it's very good indeed to welcome people. Now, can I introduce our speaker? Professor Aonghus MacKechnie is an historian, and he comes originally from the Gaelic-speaking Hebridean island of Islay. His background is in Scottish history, archaeology, and Celtic studies. His career has been varied, and he's told me this himself, starting out as an assistant minister at Govan Old Parish Church, followed by museum work in Glasgow and Argyll, and then mainly as a government advisor on the historic built environment. He teaches the course on architectural design for the conservation of built heritage at the University of Strathclyde, and that's where he's based. And he teaches as well at both the Scottish Centre for Conservation Studies at University of Edinburgh and the joint University of Stirling Historic Environment Scotland conservation course. And actually, I've read various things that you've written.
It's very well written.
His research and publications have focused on Renaissance, early modern architecture, on Romanticism in Scotland and Germany, and on the history and culture of the Highlands. And he's co-authored the 2 standard texts on Scottish architectural history, the one published by Edinburgh University Press in 1996 and the one by Thames and Hudson in 2004. Most recently, he's co-authored Scotch Baronial Architecture and National Identity, which is reissued in paperback this year by Bloomsbury, and he co-edited The Architecture of Scotland 1660 to 1750, which is published by Edinburgh University Press 2020. And he's a contributor to the forthcoming Buildings of Scotland, Lothian, published by Yale, and that's coming. Now, his talk this evening, the title's on the screen, and this connects with his current project in which he looks at Edinburgh's contribution to the Romantic era. And it's welcome, and thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Good evening. And I'd like to second what Ian said there. It's so nice to be able to see a community of people in one room. It's such a noble thing. The students today, all remote, and same tomorrow, but there we go. Anyway, my job is to talk about something else, not that. So, I was asked to talk to you about Walter Scott and the architectural style known to contemporaries as the Scotch Baronial. The obvious springboard is, of course, Scott's own Abbotsford House. I take it as a given that we appreciate the enormity of Scott's impact. For John Henry Raleigh, to have been alive and literate in the 19th century was to have been affected in some way by the Waverley novels. Well, for Ian Gow, Abbotsford is one of the most famous houses in the world. What I plan is to take Abbotsford, therefore, as a centrepiece, not to do a biography of the place, not to tell you what you already know from the guidebook, but rather a search for ideas and priorities that governed its creation, and follow that up with observations of what, to me at least, seems to be part of its legacy. Sort of, what was it, where did it come from, where did it go, what did it do, and why? It was built in 2 stages. The part behind the trees added by architect William Byrne after Scott's time, but I'm going to discuss only 2 phases. The right-hand part here with the tower, built 1817-18, and the bigger part added 1822-4. As to Scott himself, he's too big a topic for me, and people in this room are, I know, better able to talk about him than I am. But my approach is architectural, which for me demands examining context, political and cultural, different that is to aesthetics or art value discussions, and I hope I can add something from that angle to what one distinguished historian in 1991 denoted, quotes, the exhausted topic of Sir Walter Scott, rather than seem to help that fellow to have been right. Before thinking of Abbotsford, though, there's an earlier story to tell, and that's the story of Scott's youthful architectural interests. The young Scott, as we all know, was excited by traditions, lore, ballads, and the places associated with them. He had enthusiastically explored every peel tower from foundation to battlement, and he had considered 2 ruined tower house reoccupations. In Scotland at that point, possibly Castle Huntly alone, which he possibly knew from his 1793 visit to Aonghus. Castle Huntly had similarly been searched out as an ancestral property for reoccupation in 1777. Rother Church was rebuilt from ruin too from 1784. So Scott's idea was precedented, but still innovative enough. As a child, he spent long periods at Sandy Now with a ruinous Smailholm Tower within his playground. In adulthood, and before Abbotsford, he wanted to acquire and reoccupy it. The other castle ruin he wanted was Hebridean, which for him was the cradle of his ancestors, to which he made autumn pilgrimages. And all that would have been realistic after he inherited a fortune from his uncle in 1804. He never lost enthusiasm for old buildings, as the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge remarked in 1833. Dear Sir Walter and myself were exact but harmonious opposites in this, that every old ruin, hill, river or tree called up in his mind a host of historical or biographical associations. All this placed Scott securely within the realm of Romanticism, and where the best known reoccupations of the wider period then were in Germany, notably Stolzenfels in the Rhineland from 1823. And so all this presents the question, what, by the way, is Romanticism? I think we need to know something about that. Well, Romanticism has no agreed definition, and there's even been a debate, probably very puzzling to a Scottish audience, but a debate over whether Scott even was a romantic. But for us, as a shorthand, let's regard it as an intellectual and cultural movement, or sets of movements, romanticisms, which to varying extents and at varying times tended to succeed without extinguishing the age of classicism, producing a post-rules rejection of the authority-assigned classicism's principles to, as you might already have suspected, varying degrees at different times and in different places. Is that vague enough, I wonder? The emphasis was on feelings and emotions rather than Enlightenment deduction. And by rejecting the primacy of anti-classicism, replacing it provided both the option of asymmetrical buildings plus the search for the antique national as an alternative, which of course fed nationalism, as different places identified their own history, selecting paradigms suitable for revival and possible brandishing even. Hence the Gothic revival and so on. We have London's Houses of Parliament, for example, or the completion of Cologne Cathedral as the world's then tallest building, each intentionally nationalist, each illustrating Romanticism. So coming back to Abbotsford and its acquisition by Scott in 1811, how does it fit into all that? Well, let's stay with architectural context. In England, there was the increasingly popular Gothic revival, which developed as an ideology from the mid-18th century, with the belief that Gothic was invented in England and that it reached its purest or finest expression there. That particular bubble was burst by the Reverend George Downing Whittington in 1809, who demonstrated its French origin, but the nationalist rhetoric took years to subside, and meanwhile, Gothic in these islands seemed still to probably reference England, not least as the so-called Tudor style truly was nationally specific. So, from Scott's perspective, Gothic, if not necessarily 100% definitely English, was widely regarded as such and asserting itself there by revivalists, and this provided him with both a value and, as I'll come on to, an anti-value. The value? The third Duke of Argyll's 1740s Inverary Castle presented revived Gothic as appropriate for the top British politician in Scotland, and that model was both followed and developed by loyal Scottish Britons, notably by a successor in the top Scottish job, Henry Dundas, Lord Melville. And that was at Melville Castle, where Scott would visit his own old school friend, Robert Dundas. After 1788, the episcopal hierarchy successfully persuaded London that it was loyal, no longer Jacobite. A new episcopal church was built in the town, an octagonal towered version of Inverary, which therefore emitted suitable political symbolism, and Scott had a pew in that church. But In the 1810s, the increasingly confident Episcopalians built two elaborate new churches, both perpendicular Gothic, both opened 1816, both by architects who had worked in London, and both churches clearly totally English in their style. And without accepting the new Catholic Church, these buildings were a startling contrast to anything else in post-Reformation Scotland. Scott was closely involved at William Burns St John's, where his mother was buried. As to his precise impact on the choice of design, though, this seems undecided. But he must have gone along with the choice, which signalled an English-looking Britain. It was an idea road tested before then in Ireland, whose new perpendicular Gothic chapel royals decoration was dripping with pan-British historical references. So there's one aspect of Scott's views on the Gothic. Gothic was English, probably, and therefore, as the Irish had just been shown by the Crown, suitably British, oblique UK, respectfully and committedly unionist. So revived Gothic aligned with Scott's strong political unionism and ideals for Scotland. As to the anti-value of Gothic, for his intended house, would that same reek of Englishness be desirable there for his image? Well, at first it was. Scott's early ideas referenced the ideal of an Old English vicarage. All that had changed though by 1817, when work began in phase 1 of what we see today, for the intention now switched to reference Old Scotland. And his new house would have to perform a more sophisticated task than simply resembling a thing, which therefore ruled out classicism. It would have to accord with his writings as a Scottish-themed romantic poet and historical novelist. A soldier needs a uniform, a graduate a gown. Similarly, this building had to characterise the owner. The imagery was different from the usual rich house requirement of symbolising ancient genealogy, wealth and so on. In October 1816, Scott wrote of this romance of a house. I have been attempting a Gothic, no, not a Gothic by any means, but an old-fashioned Scotch residence, full of rusty iron coats and jingling jackets. Jingling jackets being armour. Then in November 1816, English models resurfaced as a choice, but the hint of old Scottish symmetry continued. I have always had a private dislike to a regular shape of a house, although no doubt it would be wrong-headed to set about building an irregular one from the beginning. A combination of English and Scottish historical sources will represent his political ideals, symbolising a shared, still new nationality of Britons. But a month later, December 1816, Scott preferred ideas as being less Gothic and more in the old-fashioned Scotch style which delighted in notched gable ends and all manner of partisans. So ideas were changing and decisions by now were needed. What sources might Scott and his team quarry? The most obvious model, I suggest, came from England and from Horace Walpole, who in 1750, with workers already on site, declared, "I am going to build a little Gothic castle." The outcome was Strawberry Hill, one of the key moments in the Gothic revival. Built between 1748-76 and crammed with historic artefacts, genealogical references, spolia, that is, bits of old buildings, and Gothic ornament. To Scott, Walpole was a man of great genius. He was the author of the world's first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, for the 1811 edition of which Scott provided an introduction, and concerning which Scott considered remarkable, not only for the wild interest of the story, but as a first modern attempt to found a tale of amusing fiction upon the basis of the ancient romances of chivalry. Walpole's Otranto even made the scary castle a participant in the narrative, providing, I suspect, more encouragement to Scott's architectural rummaging. He disdained Walpole's vanity, though, in producing a guidebook to his house. Horace Walpole, with all his talents, makes a silly figure when he gives an upholsterer's catalogue of his goods and chattels at Strawberry Hill. But Scott clearly respected him, admired his Gothic novel, and for me, it's impossible not to see the one man influencing the other. Walpole, for example, had initially concealed his authorship of his novel, as Scott would also do, and I know others did so too, but nonetheless. Unlike the formalised castellated classicism of its Scottish predecessor at Inveraray, Strawberry Hill's plan and profile were wildly asymmetrical, as Abbotsford would be. Scott appealed for Strawberry Hill to be judged gently, recognising surely that its critics would be unlikely to think much differently of his own efforts. And as the ear of the architect should not be hasty to condemn the over-learned conceits of the musician, so the eye of the musician should have some toleration for the turrets and pinnacles of the fascinated builder. And if pinnacles sounded Gothic, turrets sounded castle-like. And turning to Abbotsford more directly, when renting Ashestiel in 1811, Scott bought land at Newartoch, which he would rename Abbotsford. The choice of a site overlooking the Tweed was important to him. Both Ashestiel and his uncles Rosebank and Kelso overlooked the Tweed. Poet James Thompson's cottage was beside the Thames. The Duke of Buccleuch's nearby villa fronted the same river, also Alexander Pope's villa, garden and grotto. But probably significant too, Strawberry Hill was set to view the Thames. And these were Britain's two symbolic rivers. Also like Walpole, who created a committee of taste that had included Robert Adam, Scott's building was similarly shaped by a committee of artistically talented friends. So I'm suggesting that Strawberry Hill was a vital progenitor to Abbotsford. And as you know, of course, Abbotsford was built in two main phases. The first phase already indicated that classicism and symmetry were to go. Also, that there would be no piano nobile, that is the traditional Scots first floor main apartment. But instead a ground level main floor was required, as with English Tudor houses, which were already reaching Scotland as Tudor revival. And Burn was providing clients with ground level entrances which disguised the old piano nobile, for example, by placing the entrance staircases inside the door rather than outside. Building phase 1 provided a bay window dining room overlooking the Tweed and a sort of L-plan front as if for a tower house. Also a tower, whose parapet copied that of Melrose Abbey, with the scary external staircase to the top, rather as Queen Margaret's bower at the Nuthra Palace. And I'm sorry I couldn't get help. The photograph of the palace is closed. The high walled forecourt hints at a tower house, barracan enclosure, and the wide gateway at Abbotsford was correctly placed on one side, but here it's castellated to look medieval rather than classicising as on the most obvious prototypes such as Midhope or Roallan. The formula of replicating not from classical buildings but from historic Scottish buildings was now taken forward from the generic neo-Gothic we saw and the mini turrets popularised by the Adams in their castellated classicism. Meanwhile, between the two construction phases came the royal visit to Edinburgh of 1822, where Scott was given total charge of organisation at the Scottish end and of devising, inventing, suitable ceremonies. So here we interrupt the architectural story because for me 1822 cannot be detached from Abbotsford's phase 2. The visit was, of course, deeply political and a priority. Participants in the 1820 Rising had been crushed or executed, though their democratising ideals continued, and steamboats now facilitated travel. And in contrast to Scott's writings, which frequently questioned state authority, here all was to be loyalty. The process exemplified the state, through its dominant social classes, taking charge of identity formation by imposing its official concept of the nation, by displacing existing ideas with illusions in order to acquire a hegemonic position over its citizens, to provide new identities different from those of people's parents. In this instance, an illusory Highlandised ancient Scotland. The trope of loyal Jacobites, which applied now to a lost cause, was salvaged for adjustment as the treasonous vermin of the 1740s became virtuous, royal, adoringly loyal Britons. And bizarrely, it might seem to us, tartaned Jacobite imagery of the alienated Stuarts was now appropriated for the Hanoverian monarchy. To some, a bit of fun, but in fact serious. A new symbol of social control, hierarchy and a British royal power. Future Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, for example, a historian, he despaired of the falseness of it all and left as soon as he could. Adoring crowds, though, quite evidently enjoyed themselves, as with the Irish royal visit of 1821. For them, the prospect was novel and exciting, and they went with the flow, and it worked. Scotland was duly heritaged, almost a sort of nostalgia theme park, with a new past devised by the very man whose novels, quote, made the past believable. And has largely stayed, if in updated guise. Just look about you, and it still inspires political and cultural nationalists to attack each other. As to the architecture that best signalled the messaging of 1822, it was castellated, be that rhetorically or actually built. I don't know if that screen never existed, but the point is that Scottish neo-castellation, as with Tartan, signalled pro-monarchy, pro-union, pro-establishment, social control and royal power. So, logically, along came the codification of Tartan's Vestiarium Scoticum in 1842, and baronial architecture, the architecture of the so-called barons, was revived. Highlandism and new castellation were now the means of displaying Scottishness and Britishness. Those planning to build would take notice, beginning with Scott himself at his incomplete Abbotsford, and faced with the country and culture he had just rather reshaped through first his writings, and now with that theatre or pantomime royal visit. His Abbotsford Phase 2, inscribed with the symbolic date 1822, had to match the imagery he had sown, and so would be more venturesome still, more and more explicitly olden time Scottish and martial. Warfare captivated Scott's interest, as his novels show. This was the house's bigger part, providing the main front, and it continued but amplified the initial theme. It aimed not to copy any specific laird's house, and instead the most obvious visual reference to Linlithgow's is to Linlithgow's royal palace, which his left-hand porch resembles both in its placement and design. The off-centre projection references the orthodox charm of tower houses such as Maybole, etc. So just so that we clearly understand the Linlithgow Palace, there's its porch and a detail of it, and it's nudging towards the left. And here we see the same arrangement here at the left, but it's a version of the same porch being used here. So it's, I think the relationship's quite convincing. And as for Maybole, the idea here, referencing a tower such as Maybole with this emphasised top stage, but here it reverses a rubble below, ashlar above arrangement, and also in its placement away from the gables and polygonal. It suggests both off-centre axes of stair turrets as well as the 1610s royal staircases, for example, at the castle here. The corbel to square arrangement also, of course, became a baronial stereotype. So the point I'm making is that here's the prototype, the sort of prototype that was being looked at. Harrow, which tells you rubble, so Harrow rubble for the main shaft of the thing, and dressed ashlar at the more ornamented top. And here the same arrangement, but here reversed, dressed ashlar for the main part of the structure, and a more rubbly material used at the top. So same idea, but being reshaped. An arcade opposite the gateway that we looked at Abbotsford, it hints both at cloisters and at the Gothic screens at Strawberry Hill. On the north, the Melrose parapet reappears in a balcony. There you go. While an arched recess within a symmetrical element hints at Fyvie or Craigston, the little wall-head gables maybe Cumlongan in Dumfriesshire. I'm not going to catalogue all the references that I noticed there, but I'll come back to that topic. But inside, let's just for a moment notice the fireplace in the entrance hall deriving from Melrose Abbey's south door or cloister. While there are Tudor arches within Abbotsford itself, a specifically English formula. So in this shrine to a historic Scotland, English historic models were appropriate. But essentially, as regards detailing, these were inside. Just make sure that you understand it's the profile of the arch coming to a shallow point there, and same arrangement. Another early priority at Abbotsford was a collection of historic architectural fragments for redisplay. The retrieval of Edinburgh spolia would be known to Scott from the demolition in 1800 of the Rickshouses. For example, some of the old sculptures having been reset to its successor James Gillespie's hospital, other spolia having been taken to Woodhouse Lee by Scott's old history professor and fellow admirer of German Romanticism, Alexander Fraser Tytler. For Scott, anything old with a story was perfect. As to other intentions for Abbotsford, Scott would have known that Shakespeare's house, searched out and publicised by actor David Garrick in 1769, had become a shrine for his cult, and likewise Robert Burns's cottage, a place of pilgrimage from around the time of his death in 1796. Near at home for him, the Earl of Buchan had created a shrine at Dryborough Abbey, his temple of Scottish worthies, plus a temple in honour of James Thomson, the poet. And Strawberry Hill had survived into Scott's own time with its collections essentially intact. Surely Scott noticed that literary giants were now being celebrated through buildings, and surely he knew he was in that top league. Abbotsford would be a place of pilgrimage for celebrating his own cult, and it was a cult that might be envisaged to be permanent. The Romantic period artist was the new hero type of the time, to be seen. Artistic talent was, it was considered, divinely inspired since it could not be learned. Artists or Brahmins, argued John Blankenagel, meaning a culturally superior person, a higher caste, not by birth, but ennobled by free self-consecration. And visitors needed to find the hero located within an appropriate setting. For the ploughman poet, Burns, a cottage was ideal. Scott needed something that spoke of olden times days and was Scottish, and definitely, in contrast to the churches, not English, to match what visitors had come to see, with as many storyteller narratives crammed in as was possible. His house was the centrepiece of the theatre that was a visitor experience, and the experience would accord with the novels. Architectural critics frequently missed that point. Our modern revivalists, said Leslie Stephen in 1871, they laugh at the carpenter's Gothic of Abbotsford or Strawberry Hill. Scott, indeed, solacing himself with a painted plaster of Paris instead of carved oak, does not strike us as a very noble phenomenon. As I'm saying, it's sort of missing the point. All the historic objects Scott collected were for retention for posterity, not for disposal, and not planned for his lifetime alone. Yet, yes, antiquarians tended to accumulate private collections, but Scott had the added quality of celebrity, and his collection and house would be open for all. Abbotsford, after Scott, would become a sort of cenotaph. It would be a wholly reflective construction that would be his autobiography as historian and author, of course, but also as collector and then curator, a self-portrait, a legacy, an epitaph, and an empty tomb. But while the building's domestic aspect would continue, that is abnormal, every physical, emotional and intellectual aspect otherwise portrayed simply him. In that regard, Abbotsford is an early example of a house museum. For Linda Young, Abbotsford is the oldest formally opened house museum in the English-speaking world. The Louvre opened as a public museum in 1793, and instantly the idea that collections of historic artefacts should be reserved for elites was gone. Royalist Britain had to show itself not to be behind the Republicans. John Wilkes had proposed a probably British National Gallery in 1777, and Lord Buchan had pressed for both a Scottish National Museum and Portrait Gallery from the 1780s. Sir John Soane's House Museum of Architecture in London, which Scott must have known and must have been encouraged by, opened as the Soane Museum in 1837. Now Scott provided his own romantic museum, open to all, to the extent that high numbers of visitors might sometimes frustrate him. And this was at Abbotsford, and not at his orthodox Edinburgh house. It was another hook for his, pun intended, apologies, novel house. Romantic Scotland was headquartered here. Possibly Abbotsford encouraged the idea that rich houses should have a museum, and one, I think, unimplemented Burn project for Lauriston of 1827 envisaged exactly that. Romanticism's wish to communicate with a great person takes on the role of the medieval pilgrimage. and serves to celebrate the almighty talent of the national hero. Linda Young again suggests Abbotsford developed a craze of historic houses dedicated to writers, composers, artists, thinkers, scientists, inventors, military and political heroes. In the USA, house museums commemorate 30 presidents. George Washington has 14 houses, 9 of them temporary headquarters during the War of Independence. The intentional museum houses contained intentionally collected genuine relics. Unintentional museum houses were those such as the American president's houses, expected after the event to display associational artefacts. By being famous during the event, Abbotsford hybridised these two of intentional and unintentional museum houses. Although maybe it's more accurate to say that there was nothing unintentional about Abbotsford. Before moving on to notice Scott's legacy, we come back to William Burton. His obituarist recalled that it's impossible to avoid noticing Burton's deep and loyal interest which he took in the antiquities of his native country. These instances of his country's architecture were familiar to Mr. Burton, who seems to have studied them with particular attention, and they appear to have formed the turning point of his taste and practice. Scott and Burton, near neighbours in Edinburgh, were exploring castle revivalist ideas in the 1810s-20s. In 1819, Burton's addition to the Castle of May was asymmetrical and turreted, balanced nicely with the tower that it was getting built onto. And Scott, had he known it, might have liked it. But moving on, this document of 1828, this is Burton to Scott, document of 1828. This document made me smile because I have the image of Burton as deeply manipulative and carnivorous, though talented. So this is Burton writing. When on my way, Burton writing to Scott, when on my way to call at your house this forenoon, I learned that you had gone to the country. Well, what I thought was this might mean I waited until I was absolutely certain you had left for Abbotsford. I needed you to have time to think about this. Several months since, I was desired by the Duke of Buccleuch to prepare designs for a lodge and gateway for Dalkeith House. And upon the 6th ultimo, I met His Grace and arranged the preliminary matters connected with the plans. This might be saying, the Duke has already favoured me, you will notice he might be well disposed towards me, so perhaps you better act on this letter. It was mentioned to me that the Duke had some intention of building at Drumlanrig and had applied to Mr. Atkinson of London for advice. And although I am the last person that would desire, much less presume, to interfere with the Duke's wishes or intentions on such matters, I cannot entirely overlook the unfavourable effect which this might produce against me, and solicit your good offices on the subject, should you be under no promise to recommend Mr. Atkinson. What I'm taking from that is, I'm forcing myself right in here. Atkinson seems gone, and you know I'm a zealous Tory like you and Buccleuch. What might result should the Duke subsequently learn that you had ignored this appeal from a very vigorous Tory? Careful. It will, I am sure, however, occur to you that after obtaining the employment in Dalkeith, a London architect was engaged for Drumlanrig. I could scarcely escape the suspicion of having failed to afford satisfaction, and therefore run the risks of having both my future prospects and professional character most seriously injured, and in fact be in a much worse situation than if I had never been employed at all. Okay, let's play the Scottish nationalist card, but don't risk anything by mentioning Scotland. Let's take another line. Let's call it Edinburgh versus London. Support your own team. It's a competition between these two British cities. So, while the letter implies that Burton might be no complete stranger at Scott's front door, to me the letter seems almost threatening. But the point of me showing you this, the important thing, is that I suggest that Burton's manipulation and Scott's civility, in combination, these helped Burton win the 5th Duke's patronage, providing him, Burton, as the default architect for Tory clients, enabling Burton to implement the sort of architecture both he and Scott were developing, which is to say that by helping Burton's career, Scott also, knowingly or not, promoted the key baronial architect. In 1829, for example, Burn worked at Fiscale, providing a ground level principal floor, crow steps in place of the curvilinear gables of the Jacobean houses which were his models, Tinningham, which is here, for the Tory 9th Earl and Countess of Haddington, a remodelling, and therefore with thin and lofty components, the combination with cleverly balanced asymmetry, pointy roof turrets, and so on. Much mullion projecting square and canted bays, the foundations of the Scotch baronial style were now firmly in place, and they were put there by the Scot-propelled Burn. And Burn insinuated himself into the family's goodwill. When Scott next needed an architect for the memorial to Helen Walker, who was the prototype for Jeanie Deans, he commissioned Burn in 1830. Scott had provided the context, taste and validation for celebrating the Scottish past, plus the architectural venturesomeness and appeal. Burn, the discipline, vocabulary, practical capacity and very possibly some persuasive arguments. And so what happened next? Well, David Bryce, whose wonderful artistry had provided him at least one task for Scott, he developed the style to produce some of the best known exemplars. And this is Blair Athol. Meanwhile, Abbotsford's architects, William Atkinson and Edward Bloor, displaced, as we saw by Burn, they nonetheless benefited professionally from Scott's friendship and the magic of their Abbotsford connections. And here at this stage, there's a temptation to illustrate numerous baronial buildings, from castles to tolbooths, lighthouses, warehouses, factories, tenements and villas, each of which can be argued to owe its decoration or asymmetrical form to Scott and to Burn. Even by the century's closing years, the Burn combination of square and canted bays was applied. That's clear. Applied asymmetrical, so the canted bay and the square bay in combination. So while this part of the terrace is symmetrical, each tenement is asymmetrical. But it's hardly new to tell an Edinburgh audience that Scott had a role in the gestation of the Scotch baronial, so I'm just going to make two more points. And first, let's try this one. Tullyvolan, whose name might have an Argyllshire reference. The Laird's House of Tullyvolan, and this is how I'm inclined to pronounce it, I explained it in the last, as described in Waverley. It was described, Waverley in 1814, it overlooked a massive but ruinous tower, the former habitation of the barons of Bradwarden. A most beautiful prospect, including the noble though ruined tower, which was here beheld in all its dignity, frowning from a promontory over the river. Rather as places in the emerging tradition of literary tourism had competed to be the true setting of Alan Ramsay's Gentle Shepherd of 1725, Newhall, Woodhouse Lee and even distant Malfield, so there were competitor sites of Tullyvolan. Craighall Rattery, Dean, etc. Murthly was proposed in 1817 in preference to an earlier suggestion of it being Traquair. And after the Gillespie Graham mansion was built, the old Murthly would indeed have become the old tower. Well, that twinning arrangement of modern house, predecessor tower, was known to Scott from, say, 1750s Marchmont, Old Redbraes. But this passage in Waverley seems a good way of making sense of the noticeably popular 1820s, 50s twinning of Laird's House, ruined predecessor tower, as if they were mimicking Tullyvolan. The view of the old tower of Fortalice introduced some family anecdotes and tales of Scottish chivalry, which the Baron told with great enthusiasm. So, implicitly, any or every abandoned old tower carried a romantic history, as tower owners would notice. So we have Castle Toward and Toward Castle, Kirkhill Castle, Knock Castle and Old Castle, Keorlaw and Keorlaw Castle, Blackett House and Tower, Denwood Park and Elphinstone Castle, and so on. And lastly, Balmoral, the other of the two most famous baronial houses. But Balmoral is, of course, the first domestic royal building in Scotland since the 17th century. Its duties included signalling Victoria and Albert's ancient royal entitlement within or over Scotland. Scotland was considered a thing to manage. Queen Victoria would recycle a George IV claim of 1822, likely provided for him by Scott, that Bruce's blood flowed in her veins. There was no viable alternative by the 1850s to building in the style devised to show Scotland's loyalty, that is, symbolic castellation, tartan decoration and clothing. There's no stronger evidence that the 19th century Scotch baronial style was that of the Unionist establishment and of royal power. The armorial signals included unionism, but it's not clear that objects connected with Scottish antiquity were sought for prominent display, or even considered beyond Jacobite weaponry trophies in the antlered ballroom. So, while architecture spoke of an ancient Scotland within the UK, that is precisely like Abbotsford, the whole thing seems almost to have ignored authentic artefactual antiquity. The interior is unremarkable, while the genuine ancient tower was totally flattened, no spolia retained, and so that is then the opposite to Abbotsford and to Torrivelan. But the design, firstly the private rooms faced away from the approach copying Burns' hierarchical planning and innovations, but more obviously the whole thing fitted into the existing canon of the baronial, save for the royal magnitude of the tower, and Abbotsford was a quarry. The basics of a left-hand and Lithgow-type porch fronting a tower and a balancing turret opposite were governing features, while the much colourful flat projecting bays were also used here and elsewhere. If you look at the porch which I spoke about before, here we see at Abbotsford, porch in front of a tower, porch in front of a tower, and at the far end a turret, which has stages, and here a turret, and between there's one gable, so we see gables in between. So the similarity for me is quite clear. And the use of the multi-corbelled bays. Again, Abbotsford on the left and Balmoral on the right. The task then of exploring Scott's legacy alone, for me, disproves the idea that Scott is an exhausted topic. Ships, streets, railway engines, etc. in numerous countries referenced him, showing his impact. Hebridean Carso claimed it would be difficult to overstate the importance of Sir Walter Scott to the 19th century American reading public. Andrew Hooke noted that on the same evening in Paris in 1827, the theatre-goer could have chosen to attend one of 4 Scott plays. Sir Nicholas commissioned Adam Moneylaws to build Abbotsford-inspired pavilions in Peterhof and Sarskosilo. Denmark found in Jutland its very own Scotland. And when in Scotland in 1847, it was a great moment for Hans Christian Andersen when he was hailed as the Walter Scott of Denmark. For the UK, after Inverary, architects Robert and James Adam developed a hybridising castellated classicism. Now, in literature, Scott adjusted that concept to a hybridising language, and then to a hybrid Scots-English architecture, but there with a reverse hierarchy from the novels. And also, seizing from Gildem and James Macpherson's Ossian the anti-Enlightenment theme of a glorious Scottish past, Scott communicated via Abbotsford the celebration instead of a glorious but illusory bygone British Scotland. Abbotsford, answering English antiquarian John Britton's claim that there was no such thing as Scottish architecture, Britain was claiming it all to be English, Abbotsford helped propel the fashion for replicating old castellated Scottish designs in what became Scotch baronial with turrets, corbelling and asymmetry, Scottish architectural style. With his reconciliatory novels, Scott had used Scottish history to promote unionism in a more subtle way than his almost self-hating Enlightenment predecessors had, and Abbotsford conveyed that same implicit political message, communicating that Scotland's culture was a significant part of the shared British heritage and identity and should not be ignored. That Scottish castle revivalism implied a military nation and thus a military resource for Britain, but more simply that it illustrated, for England, the harmless imagery of a supportive neighbour, and that's a point that remained true until the fashion's 20th century eclipse. Thank you.
thank you. I really wish I could come to your class, but it's such a fascinating. Can I ask one? I'm sure there'll be a number of people who want to ask questions, but can I start with one? Going back to Balmoral, were there any German influences in the conception of Balmoral as well, and also in the rebuilt Crathy Church, the Tower of Crathy Church?
I haven't thought about Crathy Church, but as to Abbotsford itself,
Balmoral.
sorry, after Balmoral itself, yes and no. No is a better answer. It's a bigger answer. But yes, one of the things is that both Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had grown up in a culture where reading Walter Scott's novels was normal. They were all part of this romantic movement of the period, so they were romantics themselves. So, in the case of Albert, he wanted a Scottish castle. He was in the driving seat for the production of the thing. He wanted a Scottish castle. So it all fits into the William Byrne formula, except, as I said, the tower, the magnitude of that tower, it does remind me of some of the towers at Coburg itself. Some German towns have gateways with a big tower like that. So is that referencing Germany? I don't know. Is it irrelevant to mention it? I think it's not irrelevant. So, I wouldn't say yes or no. But the one thing that's obvious that is his impact, and that is some of the crests on in some of the Dormer heads. These are crests that come from Germany that tell you of his family lineage.
Yes.
So it's all politics. Whenever you get a building like that, and you put badges on it, you're making statements. I showed you one statement that was being made. There's a bit more, not much. There's a bit more British symbolism, but the German stuff is confined to celebrating his family, his origins, his genealogy, not to celebrating Germany, because the whole theme is as we see it.
Yeah, thank you. Questions? Yes, Judy.
To what extent, when Sir Walter was planning Abbotsford and looking at architectural styles, did he actually see himself living and working and writing and entertaining within? What priority did he give to that?
I don't know, but the purpose would be, he's building a thing, he's saying, I do a lot of writing, I'm going to be doing some writing in this place that I'm going to build. So it would be very important to him that he would be able to engage 100% with his ideals. And what were his ideals? Well, one of them was to do a lot of writing. So that would be vital, that would be a vital part of the consideration. But I think also vital was to get a building which matched the novels. So it was a building which expected people to come to visit. As I said, the culture of the time was, if you're a poet, a composer, people would come to see you. It's a bit like pop stars in our own time. So he would know that people were going to come. So the house had to fit into what he was writing about. And one of the things about that is Abbotsford's in quite prominent display. If you go along the south side of the river, you don't see, is there a house in there? It's not like something in Castle Milkington Fleece, you don't know there's a mansion there. But here, it's an absolute display, so you're meant to see it, and you're meant to look at it and say, I've never seen one of them before. So, and you hadn't. So he is broadcasting the messages outside, but for himself, well, for that message, the value of that message for him is to display what he's all about, as far as that goes, as a literary person whose theme, whose topic is a bygone Scotland. You want to disagree or anything?
Okay, can I ask a further question about Royal Deeside? Would you think that churches like St Margaret's, Braemar, is that a church building?
Yes, I know the one.
Yeah, does that continue this tradition?
I can't envisage it. I've been there a long time. I can't quite envisage it. But the tradition just embedded itself, and this idea of looking back to a Scotland that's gone. So you want to enjoy it again for a second time. You don't want to have it, but you want to enjoy it because you think that's brilliant, because it's a version of antiquarian thinking that we still see. Why do we list buildings? Why do we schedule monuments? Well, because some folks say they're important. Why is Edinburgh Castle not flattened and made into flats? Because there's just a sense that it's important. So these ideas that there is a value, a high value in what has been, and to present that in stone, see it in actual physical form, and try and keep the physical form. So these ideas were there, but the primary way in which they were used was in building in that style. So the style was sort of imagined, perhaps, but the idea was to look at what has been and say, we can enjoy this again, we can celebrate it by building in the same style. So that's a long way of saying yes to when you see these Gothic churches such as that. Yes, they are historicising. We want you to look at this and not think this is a zappy new thing. It's not in the new club when it was rebuilt.
Yes.
The message here was, there's a new building. Goodness me, how exciting! But the message there was, this is an antique looking thing. And that was the primary value that it had. Rather, you see, I mean.
Yes. Yes. Roger.
Just a not entirely frivolous question, but how is it that we were spared that monstrosity that you're displaying there?
I've got to say, this caption is wrong. We meant to say, it's not the view from the new club. I've picked the wrong image. Correct caption, wrong image, or reverse that. How did we spared it? Because Queen Victoria didn't like it. There were rules set that the monument, the memorial, the Alpha Memorial for Edinburgh, was to not be connected to any other building. It had to be a standalone thing. So Victoria is the one to thank that you don't have to have it, or to complain to if you think we should have had it.
No. She got it right.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, I'm interested in the connection with Scott and Hospital Field House in Arbroath, and now I know that came later, and Hospital Field is termed an arts and crafts house, but there are parts of that house which would have been around when Scott was there, and there is a tentative link to the antiquary in that his monk barns could have been Hospital Field going back then. But I'm just thinking of Patrick Allen Fraser and his masterminding this beautiful building, whether it is in the same genre in a way, although it's not baronial as such, but it's a confection which I think Abbotsford is a bit like, of somebody who's very much into the picturesque and very visual.
Yeah.
So would you see a connection there, as Abbotsford and Hospital Field?
To start off with the honest bits, I have been to Hospital Field, but it was so long ago. I was there for the launch of one of John Gifford's, the Ian Angus book, when it was dark. So I didn't see that much of it. So I don't. In my mind, what my memory tells me is it's a baronial building.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's got corbelling and turrets and things.
It does, yeah.
So I think that would fit into the category of baronial. It'd be fair to say also that baronial changed its character. I didn't have time to go into that, but I didn't want to extend it beyond Scott's own time, really, just to say this was launched and off it went, and that's really what I was doing when we were showing this. What we've got there is the style modified, it changed, but particularly after Bryce was away, so especially by the 1880s, and the new folk kind of running, well, being the prominent, the dominant architects in Scotland, people such as Robert Rowan Anderson and then Sidney Mitchell, both based here, doing fantastic stuff. They were doing something slightly different. It's still baronial, but it's moved with the times, and they might be less inclined to put on turrets and such like. So I'm not sure if this is helping answer the question, but I think also, where do you get a patron? Where do you get an architect? Where do you get a patron that's got lots of ideas? Where do you get an architect that's got the free rein to use lots of ideas? Then you've got a recipe for getting something quite innovative, and maybe that's what we're talking about, because it is quite a singular design. I can remember that, but I can't remember it in sufficient detail to give you a detailed answer.
Well, it's very helpful, because I think there's big parallels between these two individuals, because they were both very visual.
Yeah.
And Fraser, of course, was an artist, and I think of Abbotsford with the beautiful views. I think a question was, did he build this primarily to stay in? And to me, I think the inspiration of looking at the Tweed from these windows in Abbotsford, it's almost custom built, for the man to produce his work as well as entertain. Yeah.
Aye, it's clearly the views are very important. I did read somewhere that there was an earlier idea to build it down and hawk down below, and someone said, "Don't be silly, it floods." Didn't you notice? So it went up to where it is just now. But yes, the view over the river, proximity to the river, these two things I think were very important, and fitting into the pattern, as I said, in London that was the thing they loved doing, and even the Tweed itself, numerous houses enjoy the fact that the Tweed is just below them. Is it Glenmain, the house that's diagonally opposite? Is that Glenmain? It's a sort of 1860s house. I think it does the same. And even a Driver Abbey house itself, its job is to, one of its jobs is to enjoy the river which it faces. So it's a good enough thing.
As someone who lived for many years very near to Strawberry Hill and visited several times, in fact the most recent visit a couple of years ago, they had a special exhibition which brought back a lot of the original fittings and furniture and that, wonderful. But I do agree entirely about the influence on Scotland, on Abbotsford. But my question is, how well did he know Strawberry Hill?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
That seems to be a crucial issue.
My wife and I, we were in Strawberry Hill just the other week. We made it a business to go and view the place because I knew of it, of course. But while the guides were very helpful, there was a limit to the information that we were getting from them. I did wonder about that, but I didn't get on very well with it. But I tried looking it up, and I couldn't find any reference at all to Scott having actually physically been at Strawberry Hill. But not me not finding a reference does not mean that he never saw it.
Well, given this august company, some other people may know the answer to that. I don't know.
Did Scott see Strawberry Hill?
Well, I'd have thought it was necessary to see it. I mean,
No, I don't think so, because, well, one of the things, Walpole said, he wrote a book. He said, "Here's my house. Look at this. Look at that." It was engraved. Lots of engravings in it. And I showed you one with the staircase with the jingling jackets. So Scott says, "I want jingling jackets." So that image of the staircase. I also even the detail in that of the stair balustrade and that, you could, with the eye of faith, say that it connected to those little gates in Abbotsford. So the little.
but he often visited London, so you think...
Yes. And McClue's London residence was not far away as well. And
you've got all the residents on the Thames, you've got Zion House, Marble Hill Park, and Newark.
Yeah, even if he stopped from the other side of the river, I don't know. So I do not know the answer, but I did try slightly to find the answer.
Yeah.
On the question of the trajectory, can I try you on one more building, and that would be the enormous Marshall College in Aberdeen. I mean, with all of its...
That's a big, huge one.
The enormous Gothic.
Yeah.
Yes. Is that a further continuation of this? I think the continuation there is... my memory, I can't actually visualise it properly. I remember the big Gothic steeple that's there. Yes. I think it might be referencing sort of English collegiate stuff. I'm not ready to answer the question without refreshing my memory. But certainly in Aberdeen there's a lot of Baronial stuff. And the connection between Baronial and Tudor is something that played out very, very clearly in Aberdeen in the work of the architect John Smith, whose nickname was Tudor Johnny. So he was building architecture, so the Scottish architecture, but the Tudor arches that I showed you, he loved using these. So these are absolutely ubiquitous in his work. Yes. No, thank you. Mike.
Yes, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. From wandering around Edinburgh, I always find, this might be completely a misunderstanding of Scotch Baronial, but I'm always struck, I suppose, by the sheer number of what seem to be residences that are done up in a kind of Scotch Baronial style. And so if you go towards the Silvanoti, towards Cramdy Way, between there's a couple where it's really quite stunning, and I don't know what they do now. But they do seem to be almost kind of ubiquitous. I'm sure there's probably a a Pevsner in here, so I'll regret saying this, but you know, you could easily just point out lots and lots of places in Pevsner. Does it lose its sort of political associations, its national and cultural resonances as it becomes something that's a bit more democratised, and well, not democratised, but that becomes a lot more prevalent in sort of domestic residences?
And the Baronial was a very popular choice of style for villas, and in the second half of the 19th century especially, they were building villas galore. Just about every smaller town even has got some baronial villas on the edge of it. So baronialism was really, it was a really popular style, but maybe making the same point as you. But as for the decline, I think that World War I sort of changed things. It changed politics, it changed the architecture. Because one of the points that I made that this attitude, this particular political loyalty which it was signalling, all that the politics changed in the 1920s with the creation of the Scottish National Party, Hugh MacDiarmid becoming a prominent figure thereafter. So the politics, there was then this anti-politics, which you see of course today. So I think the political messaging in reality changed. Baronial maybe it had run its course, but the fashion just generally was changing towards an international modernity, and so building things concrete, sleek, horizontal, streamlining and such like. So the fashion, international fashion was moving in anyway. So the idea of a sort of national politics could hardly exist within international style. Well, it could exist, but I think I mean, you look at some of the stuff in steel maintenance stuff in the Paisley area, then there's this insistence in using rubbly stone that's continued into the 1950s, I guess. So you could argue that this is an intentional reference to what the baronial had been, but I don't know. You know, I would hesitate to go too far with that argument. So the politics hangs on, of course, but how far it was associated with a baronial that was in decline anyway probably wasn't important anymore.
Thank you. I'm going to have to go on asking questions for a long time. I think that's wonderful. Thank you. Can I, Mike Chapter is going to give a bit of thanks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. That was a great lecture. We got a lot out of that, a lot of engagement out of it. Being an artist, I'm also a musician and tourist guide that takes people all over Edinburgh, and we're doing a lot. Scott is always popping up, and we've been doing it in our Bequeathing library, and we're doing Bishop Layton's collection in a couple of weeks as virtual tours, and we've got a huge audience with Scott. There's no getting away from him. I just loved your lecture, and as an artist, I love the description that I'm on a different caste, on a different level.
But you already knew that.
I know, I already knew. So I'd like to just propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Walter Scott Club to Professor Aonghus MacKechnie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the usual glass of wine and canopies are outside, so please go and help yourself.